that impairment doesn't become a disability until society fails to make an accommodation. So the wheelchair user isn't disabled until there's no ramp for them to enter a building. The person with the sight difficulties isn't disabled until they can't access classes. And the person who is neurodivergent, who communicates differently, isn't disabled until society insists that they communicate in a certain way.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told. And today, I invite you to join me in conversation with Emily Kircher-Morris as we take a communication perspective on neurodiversity. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Emily Kircher-Morris. Emily is a former educator and gifted educator, and she is currently a mental health counselor in Missouri. She is also the host of the Neurodiversity Podcast. This is the second episode in our Unheard Stories series. We started last week by revisiting a conversation I had with Rebecca Taussig on disability from 2023, and it truly was the perfect setup for this month because I referenced that conversation in today's episode with Emily. So obviously it is a conversation that's sticking with me a year later. I think it will be clear how these conversations interrelate. But yes, I just want to reiterate up front that calling this series the Unheard Stories series is something I thought a lot about. And it's a reference to the LOOT model from CMM, which you can learn more about in my early episode on the model or from a number of resources that I've created that live on the CMM Institute Substack. And links to those places are in the show notes if you want to find them. But Unheard Stories basically emphasizes that all our stories are not listened to equally. And that can be based on a number of things like the culture we live in, the families we have, the expectations of our peers, and what we have deemed normal or right. Some stories and the people who live those stories are not heard from and are made to feel other or wrong. Neurodiversity can be one of those stories. So let's continue the conversation with Emily. Hi, Emily. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today. I've been so looking forward to it.
Oh, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have another podcaster on. I think we both have some cool knowledge to share. And I think that us coming together in conversation will hopefully spark some ideas or get some more thoughts going for both of us, ideally. To start, I would love to have you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about how you see yourself. Tell us about the work that you do and especially maybe why you're passionate about it.
Yeah, so I'm a lot of things. Primarily, I am a therapist, a licensed professional counselor, but professionally prior to becoming a counselor, I was an educator. I worked in schools. And I worked specifically as a general education classroom teacher and as a gifted education teacher, and also as a school counselor. And those experiences were all kind of driven by my experiences growing up. So I am neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was in elementary school. And that was actually at a time before Asperger's was even in the DSM. So I've never been assessed for autism, but I have a lot of those traits. I was also in the gifted program. So we use that term twice exceptional, meaning people who are both cognitively gifted and have another disability layered on top of that. So that's really been my area of passion. So I've written a few books related to both teaching and parenting that. But then I have a podcast, and my podcast is the Neurodiversity Podcast, and it explores neurodiversity in all of its shapes and forms. And I'm really passionate about helping to create a neurodiversity affirming world and helping neurodivergent people find a way to really be their authentic selves, live their best lives, and navigate the world that maybe wasn't created for them.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And I feel excited to jump into this conversation about neurodivergence too and hear your perspective on it. I, said to you before we started recording through email that the way I was going to approach this podcast is, maybe we could think of the title as being something like a communication perspective on neurodivergence. I'll bring the communication perspective. You bring the knowledge and stories and experience with neurodiversity. One of the questions that I would ask when using a communication perspective is to say, what are we making? And that lends itself to seeing communication as this force in our lives that is actually a creative force, because we're creating our social worlds. We are making things in our communication. And so it's helpful to reflect and say, what are we making? And so I'm curious your perspective on what has been made around neurodiversity. What are we making right now around neurodiversity? And then maybe another follow-up to that. What do we want to be making? What do you hope to be making through your podcast and your work?
Yeah. It's interesting. We launched the podcast in January of 2018. And at that time, if I had even heard the term neurodiversity, it was not one that really stuck with me. It was definitely probably maybe a year or a year and a half into the podcast. We obviously rebranded. It wasn't called the Neurodiversity Podcast at that time. But that term was not even part of the zeitgeist. It wasn't even really something that a lot of people knew about, even though the term was in existence. And I love thinking about the words that we use and the stories that we use and how that frames how we view certain topics, especially as a therapist, because now, although I don't think that cognitive behavioral therapy is the end all and be all, I do believe that the words that we use and the stories that we tell greatly influence how we see situations, how we reframe situations, how we handle them. So whether that's within the microcosm of an individual in the therapy office or wider society, that really is influenced. So kind of looking at a historical perspective, I mentioned as I was introducing myself that when I was diagnosed with ADHD, Asperger's was not even in the diagnostic manual. So what you have to realize about neurodivergence is that the people who have been given these identifications or these labels, a lot of times are very young compared to the general population. So Asperger's was added to the DSM in 1994. I was diagnosed with ADHD in 1991. But even at the time I was diagnosed with ADHD, girls especially were not frequently diagnosed with ADHD. But my mom was a special educator and she really advocated for me. And she knew, there were some other things going on there. So through that time, there's this process of people being trained on those diagnoses, understanding those diagnoses. When I got my master's degree in gifted education, the term twice exceptional was not a term that we were using. We talked about giftedness, and we talked about giftedness that there might be some kids who maybe have an ADHD diagnosis, but we weren't talking about autism. We weren't talking about dyslexia. And then as time has gone forward, we've dropped that label of Asperger's. We now use autism spectrum disorder. I don't prefer to use disorder. I just talk about autism usually. And recognizing that those labels shift, but that really influences how people identify themselves. So that little comment that I made about, I don't like to use that disorder term, that's another thing that's part of the neurodiversity movement. I really strongly believe that looking at neurodiversity through a strengths-based lens means recognizing, yes, these things can be disabilities. I'm not denying any of those things, but there are strengths that come along with it too. And when we focus on the strengths first, rather than the deficits, we're much better able to leverage those strengths for people to have success. So I don't like calling autism spectrum disorder.
You're right.
We can call it autism. We can recognize it's a disability, but is it a disorder or is it a different way of thinking? Right? We know that people with, with brains that are dyslexic, right? Their brains function in a different way. But they're compensating, and there are ways that they're doing this that actually they build different neural pathways. And so there's a strength there that's coming along with that. So all of those things, though, are intricately tied up in the language that we use and how we understand these things and how we then support people and create a society that is hopefully meeting the needs of all people. So that's kind of maybe some of the things that, talking about where we've been and kind of how we've gotten to where we are, at least within the neurodiversity movement.
It's so interesting how recent all of this is in the grand scheme of things, that this language is just now, maybe you have a different perspective on the timeline, but in my kind of sense, just now becoming more widely understood by people. And then it does take time from there. Right. I kind of talk about a lot on this podcast. I obviously love the communication aspect, the language, they gave out the words of everything, but I also understand that just communicating, you can't stop there. Like, how do we take that into action, basically? So I think maybe that's part of where we're at in this conversation around neurodivergence too, is that, okay, we're developing all this great, hopefully empowering language for people to understand this better. And then kind of, where do we go from there? You're reminding me of a previous conversation I had with Rebecca Taussig, who's an author and writes about her experience as a woman in a wheelchair on Instagram. She calls them mini memoirs, and then has this book called Sitting Pretty. And we also had a conversation about, okay, I've heard, obviously if you have a physical disability, you'd be referred to as, disabled, or you have a disability, that word that you just also used. And I've heard people trying to use an alternative and say a diffability as in a different ability. And I remember when I heard that, I thought, that's really interesting, but hadn't had the chance to explore it more. So I kind of brought up to her, I was like, how do you feel about that? Does that feel like great and empowering or dismissive? Like, what is it? And, obviously she was like, I'm not speaking for everybody, so people might relate to that differently. But she's saying it's kind of like dismissing, like, it is a disability, but we should change the focus, that the disability, the part that like disenfranchises you as a person with maybe a physical disability, is not you and your body being the problem. It's the way that society understands your ability in your body. And I would assume that, I can see how that translates to the conversation we're having too.
Absolutely.
Maybe, having ADHD or any other kind of neurodivergence can be understood as a disability, not because you are wrong for your brain working that way, or you learning that way, or you thinking that way, but because society has made it more difficult for you to function when you do think that way, because we've been so narrow in what we understand to be the way that human people are and act together.
Yeah, that brings a couple of things to mind. So the first one is just talking about those euphemisms that people use to talk about disability. They're differently abled, or, handy capable is another one.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is minimizing of the struggle that comes along with disability. And I think that most advocates that I'm familiar with, and again, just like your past guest, not speaking for everybody.
Sure.
But most people are willing to recognize, yes, absolutely, there's a disability that's associated with this. So when I'm doing these talks, I do a lot of presentations, I do a lot of trainings for educators and clinicians. That's one of the primary things that I do to help educate professionals about how to support neurodivergent individuals. And we talk about disability, and it is interesting because many people don't feel comfortable with that word. It makes them feel it's counterintuitive, but by denying it, it almost is a form of ableism, right? Like by pretending like, oh no, we're all equal. No, well, no, we're not. There are things that are hard. But I'll talk about, somebody may have an impairment. So somebody may have an impairment in walking, requiring them to be a wheelchair user, right? They use a wheelchair for mobility. They need it to get around. Somebody may be impaired with their sight and they need glasses. Somebody may be impaired by their neurology and they communicate differently because of that. But that impairment doesn't become a disability until society fails to make an accommodation.
Yeah.
So the wheelchair user isn't disabled until there's no ramp for them to enter a building.
Exactly.
The person with the sight difficulties isn't disabled until they can't access glasses. Right. And the person who is neurodivergent, who communicates differently, isn't disabled until society insists that they communicate in a certain way. I think the thing about neurodiversity specifically, though, is because these are invisible disabilities, because they are things that aren't easily seen, people don't understand them. And on top of that, many of the characteristics surrounding the disabilities that come along with neurodiversity are viewed as moral failings. And there's like this value system that we associate with, well, you're rude because you communicate differently, or you're lazy because you struggle with executive functioning, or you're unmotivated because you're struggling with academics. And that could not be further from the truth, because once you put those accommodations in place, once you help a student or you create an environment for, a colleague or a coworker that, again, fosters their strengths and accommodates for their struggles, they can be just as successful as others. But it requires open communication and awareness and a willingness to look at things differently in order to create those environments for people.
I, again, am thinking of this conversation I had with Rebecca, and that honestly, probably not a stretch to say one of the most interesting things I've learned from doing this podcast came from this conversation with her, and was something she wrote about in her book. And then we discussed, which was that how we think about accommodation. Again, that could apply, for people with a physical disability or like what we're talking about. How are we accommodating people? And why is it so hard to embrace accommodations for more people? And what she said is that, well, everything is already an accommodation for one kind of human body. Stairs are an accommodation for people who can walk on two legs. Someone said, oh, that, works for people whose bodies are like this. Let's do that. That happened to be the majority of people. Now we have stairs. A ramp is just a different kind of accommodation, so it's kind of like, okay, we already have accepted all of these kind of accommodations. Even I could say the 9 to 5 workday is an accommodation of the time when most people are awake and functioning at their best, but not everybody is at their best 9 to 5, and wants to be working during those hours. So it's interesting to me to think about accommodation. That kind of seems like an interesting next turn for, where our conversation is going, is that how do we embrace further accommodation, again, in this way that is not, you are wrong for, functioning in this different way, but that, yes, let's welcome and celebrate and try to better understand all these different ways of being.
I love that so much about that everything is already an accommodation. I've never seen that or heard somebody describe it that way, but that's such a good way to help people understand what we're talking about. I think there are so many things, as far as how the world has been created for, let's just say, the neuromajority, right? The way that most people think and communicate and learn. And I'll be honest, it is hard to make accommodations for a small group of people when you are trying to serve a large group of people. I don't think it's impossible. Right. Obviously, I wouldn't be doing this work if I did, but I understand the hesitation sometimes that people experience.
Yeah.
So one of the difficult things about accommodations is that what works for some people might be really have the opposite effect for others. So again, just taking the example of the classroom or the workplace, sometimes there are people who like to listen to music in order to focus better. It actually helps them focus. Well, if you're playing that on your phone or on a radio or something, but it's an open area in the office, or you're in the classroom and you just don't have that ability, but sometimes that music can be very distracting for others. So how do you manage all of those various needs? And there's this quote that I heard recently, actually, that really stood out to me that I think speaks to this. I'm formulating probably a newsletter post that I'm going to put in my newsletter about this, and I haven't really talked about this out loud. So this is kind of me just brainstorming a little bit about, again, it has all to do with the language that we use and how we think about things. Yeah. So I believe that this quote is attributed to Adam Grant, who is an author and a psychologist, and he's written a lot of different things, and it talks about how authenticity without empathy is selfish. And That really stood out to me because one of the things I've been grappling with within the neurodiversity community is I do believe sometimes that one of the difficult things is that the neurodiversity community has become kind of isolated, and especially on social media, tend to be pretty siloed. So there are people who will say, I'm neurodivergent. This is my STEM. It helps me regulate my emotions. I need to be able to do it. I should always be able to do it. And other people need to adapt. Or this is how I communicate. And if it comes across wrong to you, then you need to, understand that this is just how I communicate. And I just have a little bit of a problem with that because I just don't think that's really how the real world works.
Right.
I'm ADHD. I struggle with executive functioning, or I have a certain way that I communicate and it might be interpreted incorrectly, but I can at least understand that other people, there's still expectations and we can modify those expectations and we can accommodate the differences, but we can't just expect everything to change based on us. And ultimately what I feel like happens is when people want to be authentic without taking into consideration some of the other needs in the world around them, and then things don't work out the way that they want, it actually leads to a sense of learned helplessness.
Yeah.
As in, well, it's not working anyway, so I'm not even going to continue to try. I just feel like there has to be some sort of back and forth there. So for example, I own my counseling practice, and it's a small counseling practice. We've got about 7 other clinicians who work there, and it's a very neurodivergent workplace, lots of different things going on with people. But one of the responsibilities as a counselor, as a therapist, is that you have to do case notes after every single appointment that you have. I'm the worst. I hate it. It's like, it reminds me of going back to school and doing homework. It's like, I don't want to have to do the stuff after the fact. The accommodation that works for me is I keep my iPad next to me and I take my notes while I'm doing the session. It actually helps me stay focused. I feel like I can do it without being too disruptive to the therapeutic process. And I then don't have to go back and do them after the fact.
Right.
Some of the clinicians don't like to do that, which is fine. But there's still the professional expectation that you have to get those completed within a timely manner. And we can try to find accommodations to meet that, but you can't just say, I can't do that.
Right.
And I think that those are some things that we see in just a lot of different areas. And so that's one of my concerns sometimes within the neurodiversity movement, is that if you're in that bubble too much, you might lose out on opportunities because that's not necessarily the real world. And in the process of changing the real world, which is very slow, it's like turning the Titanic, right? It doesn't happen quickly. Right. You just have to kind of adapt as well. Like there's 2 of those things.
Yeah. Yes.
So I think I went a little bit off track of what your original question was there, but
no, but I like what you're saying. And it's generating new ideas for me. One, that I see what you're saying, that absolutely makes sense. And I can have maybe seen that for myself, even in people I've interacted with. And first, I have empathy for those people because it actually makes a lot of sense that is what has been modeled. Because what word did you use earlier?
Majority.
Yes. The neuro majority has come at people that are neurodivergent and said, you adapt to us.
Right.
This is how we communicate. You adapt to us. So when someone who is neurodivergent gets the chance to say, this is how I communicate, it makes sense. Obviously, maybe not effective, but makes sense that you'd say, well, you adapt to me instead. I just had a conversation recently and I brought up the idea that it's so hard to do something that you've never seen done before. It's so hard to do something new and create something, out of your mind. And so I could sit here and say, oh, well, there's all kinds of knowledge and information and tools in the world of like communication studies that could help someone navigate how best to communicate your needs and the way that you want to interact with people, that you can actually say that, called meta communicating about the way you communicate. So important. But for someone who, doesn't have that language that like I have, that would be really hard. But, from my experience in studying and learning about communication, it matters so much the space that we create for each other. So that quote that you just offered and then those examples immediately kind of clicked into place for me. I immediately, kind of see the connection you're trying to make there. And it matters because how we're communicating, the language we're using, the way that we're showing up to each other does matter for the story we're trying to tell or the world we're trying to create, again, in our communication.
Yeah. So that brings up kind of an interesting concept that we haven't mentioned specifically, although we've kind of talked a little bit about it, which is masking or camouflaging, which we talk a lot about in the neurodiversity community.
Yeah. Can you explain what that is for people?
Yeah. So masking, technically camouflaging is actually the umbrella term. Masking is a type of camouflaging along with mimicking. And so, but you typically people use masking more informally. And so, you'll hear that probably used more than camouflaging. But what this basically means is that people try to hide their characteristics of neurodivergence in order to fit within the wider community. So the ADHDer might camouflage through perfectionism to compensate for poor attention to detail. Right? Like they struggle with attention to detail. So then they overcompensate to mask that difficulty. You might have the autistic person who masks their need to stim. So when they get really excited, one of the kind of classic, stims that people talk about is like happy hands, where a lot of autistic people will flap their hands, which is kind of just an expression of autistic joy. But they've learned that that's not appropriate. So I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to suppress that. The dyslexic person who avoids reading out loud at all costs, and whatever way that they can do that, they want to avoid that because they want to mask that difficulty. Or the cognitively gifted individual who dumbs themselves down because, especially you see this classically in middle school girls, that is often where we see this, but in other environments and situations as well, because they don't want to stand out or be different.
Yep.
When I think about masking, though, again, kind of going back to that bubble of the neurodiversity movement, many people will say masking is always bad. People should never mask. My feeling about it is masking is generally bad and authenticity is generally better. But rather than making it either or, I feel like we need to view it with a little bit more nuance. And so one example that you often will talk about and you'll hear people say is like, autistic people, they struggle with making eye contact. And so it's hard for them to make eye contact when they're talking to somebody and so what has classically been done, especially with autistic kids, is like they've been taught, look at somebody's eyes, or if you can't look at somebody's eyes, look at their nose or look at their ear. So basically you can fake or mask making eye contact. To me, a better way to handle that than teaching somebody to camouflage or mask is to ask them and help them understand, like, when are you masking? When are you camouflaging? What is the impact that it's having on you? What are the stakes of that situation? And what other choices do you have? So maybe in some environments, I'm comfortable enough and trust the person enough to say, I want you to know that it's much easier for me to focus on what you're saying when I'm looking at my hands or looking at the floor. It's really distracting for me to try to make eye contact, but please know that I'm still listening. So then we can have that advocacy piece. But there might be situations where that person chooses to mask and recognizes, like, this might be a better situation for me to act as though I'm making eye contact or have some strategies in order to do that. Not because I feel like I need to comply with what everybody always says, but just in this situation, when I weigh out the benefits versus the drawbacks, it makes more sense for me to go ahead and mask in that way. Yeah. Because I can handle it, or, whatever that might be. Now there may be some, and that equation is different for everybody. Sure. But just like the solution shouldn't be, you should always mask or camouflage. The solution shouldn't always be, you should never mask or camouflage. Right. It has to be done on a case-by-case basis. And so when I work with my clients, that's really one of the things that I really try to focus on, is helping them realize sometimes they're masking or camouflaging unconsciously. They don't even realize that they're doing it, but it's causing them a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. So helping them build that awareness of when they're doing it And that way they can choose whether or not I want to, or whether or not I don't, and how that can then influence my relationships or my professional success or whatever that might be.
Right. Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. And kind of what I'm hearing, or kind of the story I'm starting to tell in my own head, is that if we're to kind of go back to that question I asked of, what's the story that's been told about neurodivergence, and what kind of new story are you hoping to be a part of telling? That one way to say it is that the story that's been told was really simple, and the new story needs to have some more room for complexity, because the fact of the matter is that it is complex. And that resonates with me because the actual communication theory that a lot of my work is rooted in, CMM, coordinated management of meaning, has been criticized for being too complex. And, that makes sense because you want people to be able to understand it. You want it to be accessible. And that's part of the work I'm trying to do. But also part of me is like, it has to be complex. If your theory is trying to in any way speak something true and real into a complex world, into something as complex as human relationships and communication, then the theory itself has to kind of reflect that complexity back. And it's not a bad thing, again, for something to be complex, but it's challenging to navigate when you don't have the right language and tools to do so.
Yes.
I'm thinking about what you're saying about authenticity. Another word that I, probably tend to couple with that is like being vulnerability. And I love that word. And I think of it like, sharing or being open, that's vulnerability. But someone with a totally different perspective, maybe someone who's, I don't know, in the military, I'm trying to think of the best, vulnerability, being vulnerable would have a totally different context. It'd be totally negative, So I'm thinking about that situation that you just kind of, presented, and saying that, yes, vulnerability does have two sides to it. And so anybody, not just someone, with a neurodivergence who's masking or not, has to assess a situation and say, where am I safe to be vulnerable, and weigh those pros and cons, like you said, because there's kind of the old way of thinking of communication is called the transmission model. And that would be, person A sends message to person B. But that's so simple, so that's the same thing. The old story about communication was simple. The new story has to be complex because it actually is really complex. And if we have the language, then we can better navigate that complexity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think part of the reason maybe you and I gravitate towards podcasting is because you get to explore that nuance a little bit more.
Yeah.
As opposed to, like, I see people who do a lot of like social media and different things. And it's like, feel like I can never distill my thoughts well enough to express them in that way. So I really struggle with that. Here's another example of how I feel like neurodiversity, the story that has been told, and what we need to change about it. People like to use shortcuts for advocacy, meaning that they like to justify what they think people need and make some generalizations in doing so, and they lose the nuance. So here's one example. In the gifted ed world, parents of kids who are identified as cognitively gifted and educators, one of their main tenets for advocacy has been that giftedness is really hard. It comes with a lot of negative things, and it has to be supported. But really, the research doesn't show that. The research shows that in general, intelligence is correlated with much better life outcomes, salary, happiness, longevity, all of these different things. But the reason they try to focus on some of these things is because they feel like it makes their case better. Like, oh, well, giftedness is really hard, so therefore we need to support it.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So I like to flip that a little bit and say, no, giftedness needs to be supported, because if it's not supported, that's when you have some of these things, such as some of the difficulties with relationships or the emotions, all of these different pieces.
So the difference you're making is it's not innately
correct
challenged, but when left unsupported.
And when it's the environment, right? So here's another example. So many autistic people struggle with empathy in various ways. Now, you can divide empathy into two different categories. You can talk about cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy has to do with predicting what another person is thinking. Okay. So like if I'm in a conversation, can I guess what you're thinking in that moment and then kind of predict how I'm going to respond? Affective empathy has to do with, well, it's more aligned with compassion. So like if I know how you're feeling, can I feel that alongside you? Can I, experience that? Many autistic people struggle with the cognitive empathy piece, but not so much with the affective empathy piece. However, there are people who have varying levels of both of those things who are autistic. So when sometimes people will say, oh, well, autistic people are some of the most empathetic people that you will ever meet. That is true for many of them. And I do think that this idea that autistic people lack empathy in general is a really bad, like we don't want to have that stereotype out there.
Yes.
But we don't want to go to the absolute other side either. You lose all of that nuance. Or for example, the idea that autistic people are all like computer codey, mathy people. So here's my unfounded, unscientific hypothesis about this. So I will just preface that with this. I don't know, there's probably some evidence to this, but this is how I interpret this. I believe that because of the way the diagnostic process works and because of how we research things, the people who initially are identified as autistic tend to be those mathy, computery systems people, because part of the diagnostic criteria for autism has to do with communication specifically and communication differences. So those people are more likely to struggle with communication differences. There are other autistic people who I believe are much more language-based. So for example, I myself, language is one of those things that fascinates me. Yeah. As a matter of fact, outside of high school, I was actually supposed to go into the Air Force to be a cryptologic linguist.
Oh my gosh.
Because I loved, and I actually had gone through the whole testing process and it had been accepted and all of these different things. And so that was what I was going to do, because breaking down language and systemizing the language. And also I love writing. Yeah. But what I think that means though, is that the communication differences that go along with autism in people who see language that way, as opposed to the numbers, tend to mask a little bit more easily. Right. So therefore they aren't identified as easily. So then we have this stereotype that autistic people are all these, number crunching, computer geniuses. I'm sorry, that's very minimizing, because you have many autistic individuals who also have intellectual disabilities. So that's, so I don't want to just recognize that as well.
The takeaway is generalizations don't work.
Correct. Yeah. And we just have to look at it a little bit more deeply. And I, I'm encouraged, because I do believe that's happening, but, language is always shorthand. I have a friend who is a clinician. His name is Brandon Tessers. And, one of the things he talks about with diagnosis of all of these things is basically like, autism is not a real thing. ADHD is not a real thing. Bipolar is not a real thing. These are social constructs, but essentially what happens is, the way he describes it is like, if you have a fence and, you're shooting at a fence just kind of randomly, and then you go up to the fence and you see where all those bullet holes are clustered, and you draw a big circle around it and you're like, this is this. Yeah. It's like, well, that's what it is, because that's how we see it. Yeah. And so then we call it that. We come up with a name. We're going to call this autism. But that's just shorthand. It's a way to communicate an idea, but it really doesn't always get the whole point across. And so I think neurodiversity is really dealing with some of that, where we're trying to really understand it and break down these things. I think social media in a lot of ways has reduced the nuance with those conversations that we're able to have, which I think in some ways is good, but in some ways is confusing and has some negative effects as well.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. And to push us a little further into that point is the language that, we both talk about, that I see as being such a positive thing. Having language, being able to name that, immediately gives you so much power, I think, most of the time.
Yeah, totally.
But also I understand that, especially around this conversation, like having, like you said, a diagnosis, I could see that for some people that's maybe really empowering. But then on the flip side, there's maybe ways that feels isolating or not helpful to people.
Mm-hmm.
And again,
Limiting.
all about, perspective and your experience, and meaning is another thing. Like you're, talking about social constructs, and I'm all about the social constructionist perspective. And a big part of that to me is, what's the meaning that we're making? And so I think I said, okay, language and then action, but maybe I'd put one more step between those two: language, meaning, and then actually, if we've come up with this language to say, okay, you have ADHD, you are autistic. Okay, there's language. What does it mean? What does it mean to every individual? So I'm curious just to know a little more about the way that you've seen giving language to people around this, whether it is the actual diagnosis or maybe just understanding better different function or ways that these neurodivergences look. How have you seen that maybe be helpful to people? But I also know maybe this is going to lead us to talking about how it's kind of not helpful to people because, like you got at earlier, it's not an either or, it's more of a both and. There's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah. So I often talk about how in a utopian world, we wouldn't need these labels because the accommodations and the supports would just be available.
Yeah.
However, we're not there yet.
Not there.
And I find that having language does give people a sense of identity. And we talked earlier, about the moral value that people assign to characteristics of neurodivergence. And I frequently talk to parents specifically, usually, who are considering going through the diagnostic process or trying to weigh out what they want to do. And one of their main concerns is that they don't want to label their child, right? Because they're worried that then, what if they internalize that? What will that mean? How will society see them? All of these different things. My response to that is they're already being labeled and they're already internalizing those labels. But what are those labels? For me as a kid, I internalized that I was too emotional, too loud, too annoying, unworthy of being liked by my peers, a bad student. Like those were the messages I received. When I got the label of ADHD, though, it gave me context to put that into perspective. And I find that overall, at this point, labels generally are empowering, even if at first it's really hard. So I can think of a couple of different clients that I've had who, when they first find out that they are autistic or ADHD or whatever, that feels really negative to them. They feel bad about that. They feel like they're broken. But in the long run, it actually helps them to accept themselves much more because they realize like, okay, this is how I'm wired. This is what I need.
Yeah.
And it normalizes that. Plus it offers a sense of community. For as much complaining as I'm doing about social media, I do think that that's one of the things that has been an asset is that it helps people to connect with others who are experiencing similar things. And so, I think that that's a process, and trying to figure out like, what is the correct label and what, we talk a lot about that. And like I said, I could talk both sides of it. On the one side, it really matters. On the other side, it doesn't matter. But
right. Yes. No,
but also this is where we are now.
In the camp of everything matters so much and nothing matters at all. And those are true at the same time. No, I get
absolutely.
Not to say that this is the same, but I'm resonating some of my experience with what you're saying is that I was recently diagnosed with celiac disease. Awful. And that's so upsetting to me. And the only option is to be gluten-free for the rest of my life. And so it's hard for someone to tell you, hey, right now your life's about to be different forever. And you're going to have to, be committed to this change and do this work just to function in the world. And so it's hard to accept that. And at the same time, it is infinitely better than where I was months ago.
Yeah.
Saying, I feel so exhausted all the time. My brain is not working. I don't feel like myself. Everything is going wrong in my body. I am not functioning properly and having no name for it.
Right.
Knowing that it's kind of like, maybe, you tell me if I'm off, but relating it back to what you were saying is that you're going to be labeled.
Right.
Either way. And you could let other people kind of label you and maybe focus on these negative things or try to find answers without having answers. I don't know. I'm losing myself and trying to relate this back to each other. But basically what I'm trying to say, I'll just speak for myself here. That's better. It was so hard to know these things about myself, know that these things were happening, but not have an understanding of a why.
Yeah.
And it is also hard to admit and accept that I have an autoimmune disorder that's disruptive to my life. And yet it is also so helpful because it makes me look back at those months that were really hard. I had kind of a concentrated symptoms, I guess, and go, I wasn't crazy. I had an autoimmune disorder that was undiagnosed. So I wonder if that's, experiences similar for people getting diagnosis of different neurodivergences.
Yeah, I believe it is. And I think the other thing is that it then gives you a path forward.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, now I know what I need to do. And Alfred Adler is a psychologist, and one of his quotes that always stuck with me is something about all of human life is a striving for perfection. And what he's talking about there is not actually perfection, but that humanity is about striving for an ideal or growing and improving oneself. Like every human is on this path of self-discovery and self-improvement. It doesn't matter if they're 8 or 80. Everyone can tell you what it is that they're working on for themselves. And I think the idea that if you're just blindfolded and throwing darts at a dartboard, trying to figure out what's going on with celiac, or any of these things,
right?
It's like, that something's wrong, that something sometimes it's not even, especially within the context of neurodiversity, it's not even necessarily that something's wrong, but it's like something's not fitting.
Yes.
Something's not aligning. Once you have that context, though, it gives you a path forward. Yeah. And I think that is where the empowerment comes from.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a beautiful, much more eloquent way of what I think I was trying to say, of like, you in your body, in your mind, soul, whatever, you are engaging with the world. And like you're saying, it's like, okay, something's not right. Something's not fitting the way it's supposed to be fitting. And that, but you don't have the reason for it. And so, yeah, like you said, once you have a path, maybe at the beginning, there's a little bit of like, I do not want to walk down this path right now, but at least you have the path and it is there for you and you're ready to walk down it. And there will be, more empowerment and liberation in walking down that path.
Absolutely. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
But at least you know where you're headed.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that's come up a little bit in some of my other conversations about overexcitability is that so much of the conversation about, giftedness, overexcitability, neurodivergence is about what it looks like in the education system. But what's interesting to me is, the other side of this story that I'm not at least hearing talked about as much, and maybe you can point to where it is being talked about, is in just adults in their lives, in their work. Yeah. What it looks like for people to navigate that. I hear that conversation so much less.
Yeah.
Whether it is about like people that are not diagnosed until they are adults, or people who, do already know that they're part of this neurodivergent community and just navigating their life as adults. Because I imagine that's an entirely different conversation.
Yeah. I think that the conversation is starting. I think especially surrounding workplace, neurodiversity in the workplace, I do think that is something that happens. So I work frequently with different businesses who are working to create more neurodiversity affirming environments. And so that conversation is getting there. I find that going back to that very first piece, though, that we talked about the history of neurodivergence and the diagnostic process and kind of where that all started. If you think about it, so if Asperger's was added to the DSM in 1994, my first year as a classroom teacher was this 2001-2002 school year. And midway through the school year, the school counselor came in to me and said, that student so-and-so in your classroom, I think he has this thing I just learned about at a state school counselors conference called Asperger's. 2001, the school counselor had just heard about at Asperger's, right? So we're in 2024 right now.
Yeah.
So that was 2001. That was third grade. So that student was 8 years old at that time. So 24 years later, so that student is now 32. So And all of these diagnoses tend to be given to children.
Yeah.
So the adults who are coming to this diagnosis often are adults whose kids have been diagnosed and then they realize it for themselves, or they've come across it. Like they're like, something's wrong. And so they're doing their own research and finding it. But typically, where do those referrals come from? They come from your kid's struggling in school.
Yep.
And so if you're an adult and you're struggling, then that's on you, right? Like that's what society, no boss is going to come to you and say, I think you might want to get screened for ADHD. Yes, I mean, maybe, but and so that's part of the reason why, but I do feel like those conversations are starting to happen. I hear people talking about neurodiversity and mixed neurotype couples and relationships and some of those things. And so I feel like those are starting to happen, but you're right. It's not as prevalent. And as those people who were diagnosed as kids start to become adults, like that just facilitates that conversation more. As those people become the people in power, they're going to be initiating those changes. And so, it's a process, and I'm not the most patient person, but, I'm optimistic that it will continue to shift.
Yeah. That feels really helpful to situate that, to say, like, really the first people who are getting diagnosed as kids in schools are only in their 30s right now, which is not to say, of course, that no one before anyone in their 30s had never had, experienced these things. But again,
correct.
The language
they didn't have the label.
Time.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm thinking about one more way I want to kind of frame this conversation, if I may teach you a little bit more about my communication theory. One of the models within the theory is called the hierarchy model. And I'll share that because that's the actual name of it, but I prefer to think about it more as a heterarchy, which obviously is, a more flexible hierarchy. And it's about considering contexts, kind of maybe looking at behavior, or what we'd call like an episode of communication, and then saying, well, what was kind of the motivator for how I acted in that moment? And you're always, being affected by a multiple context. One is maybe identity, or the sense of how you see yourself. Another is relationship. Another could be, the society that you grew up in, the culture that surrounds you. All of these things, could be levels of context that are shaping you, but, maybe there's something specific to be learned or gained. If you take a moment to say, what's my highest level context right now? What is motivating me in this moment? One example that's really simplified, but gets at the point is like, maybe we're in a relationship and we're fighting. My highest level context is being right. So I keep pushing and I keep staying my point and, correcting you or whatever. The other person's context might be maintaining harmony in the relationship. That's what they're most motivated by in that moment. So they maybe back off, or they choose not to say things they're thinking because they don't want to say something they'll regret that will break that harmony. So different people can experience the same episode with different layers of context, basically. As I was thinking, before this conversation about what the story around neurodiversity looks like right now, to me, one way of understanding it is to say, historically, our highest level of context as a society has been, I don't know, there's a million ways I think I could say this. None of them feel exactly right. Maybe you have a word for it, but, something like maintaining tradition, maintaining what's familiar to us.
Status quo,
right? Maintaining what works for the majority, maybe kind of way of being in the world that is exclusive and fearful of things, people that are different. That feels like a highest context that's been guiding us. And that's part of what shapes the story that we have around neurodivergence going forward. And again, the great part why I want to call it a heterarchy instead of a hierarchy is that these are flexible. Right. Maybe in one moment I'm guided by X context, but in another, not the same. And we have choice about what motivates me? What do I want to be motivated by? And if that really was my highest level context, how would I act as if that were true? So going forward, if our highest level context as a society could be more like being inclusive, being open-minded to other ways of being accommodating to many ways of being communicative about our expectations or the way that we want to show up to each other, how we want other people to show up to us. Those kinds of things as a highest level context feel like the things that can lead us down this path of a news story around neurodivergence, and not just for people who are neurodivergent, but for everyone.
Right. Absolutely. And I love that concept of considering the context for which we're looking at a situation and how we can adapt that. And I think something to remember is that a neurodiversity affirming world is better for everybody.
Yeah.
How many of us have used that ramp, even though maybe it wasn't put there for us because we're tired that day or we're carrying some heavy things, right? The more we can create that, the more we can have that flexibility, the more we can look at it through that lens, as opposed to the one of maintaining the status quo and being fearful of things that are different. It's not just good for neurodivergent people. It's good for everybody. It's good for society. It's good for the economy. It's good for all of the things. And so there's no reason not to shift that. Other than we're not used to it. And it's different. And change is scary. But we can do it. We can definitely do it.
We can definitely do it. Yeah. And I appreciate that as we, maybe kind of transition to the end of our conversation. I like to end using this language that I'd use in my, social constructionist communication perspective of what is a better social world if we have choice and power in shaping our social worlds. Then what's the better social world that we're working towards? So I want to, offer you that language and ask from your perspective, what does a better social world look like in terms of neurodivergence?
I just used this phrase and I probably used it a few times, but I go back to this about creating a neurodiversity affirming world. What does it mean to affirm? Affirming means to accept, to allow, to endorse, to leverage, all of these different things. And so when we create that neurodiversity affirming world, that's one that allows for every person, regardless of neurological wiring, to reach whatever their potential might be and to achieve their goals, whatever those might be. And those can look very different for many different people. But we don't need to decide what those goals are for them. We want them to have the autonomy to determine that on their own. That self-determination is so important. And so that's what I conceptualize as where I hope we're headed.
Yeah, I see that. And it's exciting that there's, resources out there like books you've written, the podcast that you're doing that are giving people that language. I think we, maybe share a goal in both of our topics that we, work with, in that just making this language and tools and resources more accessible to people. And I think that matters for moving us toward the better social world. I hope it does, at least.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Emily, before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, I mean, I think, if people want to connect, I am on social media, although I don't post as often as I should. So I'd love to connect with folks there. If they want to check out the podcast, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely.
But I just really appreciate the time and the opportunity. And this was an awesome conversation. I'm really happy to be able to share it with people.
Yes, I'm so glad that you were willing to be a part of this conversation. And I'll share links to all the places that people can find you and your work so they can easily connect back to you, listen to your podcast, read your books, get connected to your work. So thanks so much, Emily. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Abby.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Emily. As you know, I like to offer some reflection questions, which act as a next turn for us, so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. So the questions I would have you think about today are: how can you practice both authenticity and empathy as you interact with others? And how can you create a neurodiverse affirming space in your social worlds? Whether you identify as someone with a neurodiversity or not, maybe you are someone that is in a relationship with someone who is neurodiverse or has other people in your life who are neurodiverse, or maybe you don't think that you know anybody that's neurodiverse, or you're trying to figure out if you are and trying to get a diagnosis later in your life. Regardless, I think there was so much value in this conversation today for all of us to be rethinking how we are engaging with each other and how we can and should continue to strive to create more space and more accommodation for more and more ways of being. You can reach out to me to share your reflections as well as your own questions or ideas. And you can do that through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. Links to all of those places are in the show notes. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. Other great ways to stay in dialogue are to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, which helps get the podcast in front of more people. And most importantly to me, I hope you will share this episode, the previous episode, and any other episodes that have been meaningful for you with someone you want to invite into the conversation. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to move us closer to those better social worlds and empower us as we create them. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives like Cosmopolis, the Cosmo Activities line of resources, and our new Substack at the links in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.